47 Hell's Angels filled the back rows of a private school concert hall on a Friday night in December. Not one of them spoke. On that same stage, an 11-year-old girl in a second-hand velvet dress was about to do something a credentialed professional had certified. In writing, she was incapable of doing. She had been preparing for 9 months. Alone. Through an open kitchen door, to a father who always found a reason to be nearby, but never once turned around. This is Waverly's story, and sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it stands still, turns its back, and listens. If that hit you the way it hit me, subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. Drop your city in the comments and stay with me. That's good, Wave. That's real good. Ezra Marsh said it without turning around. He was at the kitchen counter with his back to her, both hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold. He stood that way for the full length of what she sang. 3 minutes and 47 seconds. When she stopped, he picked up the cup. He went to work. He did not say another word about it that morning. He did not need to. She knew he had heard every note. He knew she knew. And in the silence between them, in the particular quiet of a kitchen where toast had gone cold, and machine oil lived in the creases of a man's right hand, and a child sat at a table holding music that should have made him cry, something was being passed that neither of them had the words for yet. It would have words eventually. In a concert hall, on a December night, 23 of them, spoken into a microphone in front of 200 people, the first time Ezra Marsh had spoken publicly about his son in 8 years. But we are not there yet. Waverly June Marsh was 11 years old, 4 feet 7, 71 pounds of concentrated attention. Wide gray eyes that held contact longer than was comfortable. Not defiance, the hyper-awareness of a child who had learned to read rooms before entering them, who had learned that the gap between a person's expression and their intention was where the danger lived. She had a small scar through her left eyebrow from a fall at age 7. When she was about to sing, her face went completely still in a way that made adults stop what they were doing without understanding why. She also had a stutter, moderate, managed, present on hard consonants, and on her own name, Waverly, she would say sometimes, the sound catching before she could release it. She had stopped explaining it to people at age 8. Explaining it to adults made them more certain something was wrong with her. She had learned there was no explanation she could give that would make a person who had already decided see something different. What she couldn't explain, what she had long since stopped trying to explain, was that it disappeared entirely when she sang. Not softened, not managed. Disappeared, as if the stutter and the singing came from entirely different places inside her, and the singing place had a light in it that the stutter place never found. This is documented neurological fact. The motor pathways for speech fluency and singing fluency run through different neural systems. A stutter in conversational speech predicts nothing about a person's vocal performance capacity. This information is available in any introductory speech pathology text. Preston Forsyth had received the clinical documentation when Waverly's application was submitted. He had cited the stutter in his exclusion letter anyway, but we will get to that. The score was titled December Canticle for Young Voices, printed on paper gone cream with age, soft at the folds. In the top right corner, in a careful pencil hand, for Eli, December 2013. Below the title, below the composer credit, E. Caldwell Marsh. The tempo marking was written twice, once in print and once in a looser hand, as if the composer had second-guessed himself and then decided to trust the first instinct. Waverly found it on a Saturday in the storage boxes she'd been going through to find the winter coats. She read the inscription. She turned to the first page. She didn't ask about it. She was 9 when she was adopted, and she had understood, with the particular intelligence of children who have learned to read silences, that some things were not ready to be spoken yet. She took the score to her room. She read it the way musicians read, not just seeing the notes, but hearing them, a whole voice assembling itself in her head from dots and lines on a page. By the end of that Saturday, she knew the opening 8 bars by heart. By March, she knew every note. On the Tuesday morning in March, when she came downstairs and sat at the kitchen table and sang, quietly, to herself, or so she presented it, Ezra had not slept well. The kitchen smelled of toast and the machine oil that lived permanently in the creases of his right hand. He was at the counter with his back to her. The coffee was getting cold. His hands, when the first note came through the kitchen air, went completely still. He did not turn around. He did not move for 3 minutes and 47 seconds. He stood with his back to her and let the piece do what it had always done to him, find the specific place in his chest where 8 years of something had been quietly accumulating, and press on it. When she stopped, he said what he said. He picked up his coffee cup. He went to work. Every morning after that, Waverly practiced with the kitchen door open. Every morning after that, Ezra found a reason to be in the hallway, the living room, anywhere within earshot. They never discussed it. She always knew he was listening. He always knew she knew. And each morning, through that open door, 9 months of notes and silences, and a father standing very still, built something between them that had no name but was real, in the way only quiet things are real. Permanent, unspoken, deep enough to hold weight. What he didn't know was that she had understood the inscription from the beginning. For Eli. December 2013. She had not asked him about Eli. She had simply, steadily, learned every note of the piece his son had never heard. And one day, she didn't know when, she just knew it was coming. She was going to sing it somewhere he could finally turn around. The exclusion letter arrived on a Tuesday. Harwell Academy letterhead, formal and clean. It informed Waverly June Marsh that following a thorough artistic assessment, she had been found unsuitable for the winter showcase performance. Her spot in the youth choral program was being redirected to a student, in the letter's exact phrasing, better positioned to benefit from the opportunity. Signed by Preston Alton Forsyth, Dean of Academic and Arts Programming. It arrived 3 weeks before the concert. Ezra read it at the kitchen table. She watched his face the way she had learned to watch faces, cataloging everything, filing it. He did not change expression. He folded the letter. He put it in the drawer where he kept important documents. He said, "We're going to that concert." She did not ask what he meant. She took the worn score out of her school bag and set it on the table in front of her, and pressed her thumbnail into the pad of her index finger. A self-regulation technique she had developed alone, grounding herself when the world required it, and she did not say anything at all. What neither of them knew then was that 11 days later, Waverly would stay late at school to return a music stand to the Arts Wing storage room, that she would hear Forsyth's voice through a door not quite closed, that she would stand in a dark hallway for 4 minutes and listen to one side of a phone call that she would not fully understand, but that her father, when she repeated what she'd heard, would understand completely. What happened next would not just be about a concert. The pre-concert reception at Harwell Academy was the kind of event that made a building feel like it belonged to a different class of person than the ones who taught in it. The main foyer had vaulted ceilings and donor portraits in heavy frames, and a banner reading Harwell Youth Arts Showcase, an evening of excellence. A string quartet played Vivaldi in the corner at a volume designed to be ignored. The floor was marble. The heat was up. 60 adults in blazers moved through the space, performing the easy confidence of people who had never been asked to justify their presence. It was 6:48 p.m., 31 degrees outside. Waverly's black flats were slightly too large. She'd stuffed the left toe with a folded paper towel, which produced a faint, compressed sound on the marble with every step, a sound she was acutely aware of, and others were not. She had not told her father about the shoes because he had already spent money on the dress. The dress was dark green velvet, bought second-hand, hemmed by her father using a YouTube tutorial and a borrowed sewing kit. The stitching at the hem was uneven. The length was perfect. She carried the worn score in her school bag. She didn't need to bring it. She knew every note. She brought it the way you bring something you are afraid of having taken. Ezra walked in beside her, wearing dark jeans and a black button-down shirt he had ironed that afternoon in the kitchen while she was getting ready. She had watched him do it without saying anything. His cut was folded over the back of the kitchen chair at home. He had decided not to bring it in. He didn't want to make it harder for her. That decision, the folded cut, the ironed shirt, the deliberate choice to make himself smaller so his daughter could move more freely through a room that had already decided she didn't belong, was exactly who Ezra Marsh was. Not what people assumed, not what people saw first, but what was there, underneath, constant. The first rejection came before they had crossed the check-in table. An administrative assistant in her 40s, clipboard in hand, event coordinator lanyard around her neck, scanned the attendance list and found Waverly's name with a notation beside it. She looked up. She smiled with the practiced efficiency of someone who had delivered this sentence many times. She said they were welcome to watch from the general seating area, but the pre-concert reception was reserved for performing students and their families. She did not look at Waverly when she said it. She moved on to the next family before the sentence was finished. The notation beside Waverly's name meant the exclusion had been designed to prevent them from coming at all. They had come anyway. The efficiency of the pivot made clear this was not personal. It was policy, which, as every person in a second-hand dress in the wrong room has always known, can be worse. Waverly pressed her thumbnail into her finger. 15 minutes later, a man Ezra had met at orientation 4 months ago, a man who had used the word community and shaken his hand, and seemed to mean it, made eye contact across the room, held it for 1 full second, and then turned his body 30 degrees away. The man's companion glanced at the cut of Ezra's jacket, then at his boots, then at the middle distance. They drifted toward the center of the room. There was no hostility in it. That was the thing that was hardest to hold. It was the calm, social arithmetic of people who had decided, without malice, that proximity had a cost they did not intend to pay tonight. Waverly saw it. She recognized the shape of it. She had been watching adults make that calculation her entire life. She kept her face still. Ezra crossed the room directly to Forsyth. He was calm. He did not raise his voice. He said he would like to understand the criteria for the assessment decision. Specifically, because Waverly had been preparing the material for 9 months, and the documentation had been submitted with her application. Forsyth listened with the expression of a man who has managed this conversation before. Then he said, at a volume the surrounding board members could hear, that he understood this was disappointing, but that the program had a responsibility to its integrity. That not every child, and this was not, he made clear, any reflection on Ezra or his family. Not every child had the foundational preparation a performance of this caliber required. They had to think about the ensemble. He paused. He glanced at the cut of Ezra's jacket. There are wonderful community programs, he said, that might be a better fit for Waverly's background. He smiled. He moved on. The word background does a great deal of work in very few letters. It communicates everything while proving nothing. It is chosen with care, the way people choose weapons they can put down in public without anyone seeing they were holding one. The men on the board within earshot heard it. Nobody disagreed. Waverly heard every word. She did not look at her father's face. She pressed her thumbnail into her finger and thought about the score in her bag, and the 9 months of mornings, and the open kitchen door, and she made herself hold on to all of it like a rope. The fourth rejection came in a blazer with a Harwell Arts Foundation lapel pin. One of the school board members, the woman who had organized this year's fundraising gala, approached with what appeared to be genuine warmth. She introduced herself, said she'd heard about the situation and wanted him to know the board took these concerns seriously. She handed Ezra a card. He was welcome to submit a formal review request after the new year. The process, she said, was designed to be fair to every child. We want every family to feel this school is a place for them. We really do. But we also have to trust our educators. That's what the foundation is built on. She meant it. That was the hardest part. She was not performing sincerity. She had genuinely convinced herself that handing him a card was help. The review deadline on the card was January 15th. 6 weeks after a concert Waverly would not be performing in. The third board member in the group, who had not spoken, looked at Waverly's face for 1 full second, really looked, and then looked away. She was the only person in that foyer who understood what she had seen. She made the calculation and looked away anyway. Ezra took the card. He put it in the same pocket where he'd been carrying the piece of paper Waverly had set on the kitchen table 11 days ago. A single word on it. Kellerman. 11 days before the concert, Waverly had stayed late at school to return a music stand. She still had a key from before the exclusion. She heard Forsyth's voice through his office door, pulled to but not latched, and she stopped in the hallway. She stood there in the dark for 4 minutes and listened to one side of a phone call she didn't fully understand. The Marsh application was never going to clear. I flagged it in September. The girl has a speech impediment, and the father showed up to orientation on a motorcycle. That's not the optics the showcase needs. A pause. The Kellerman girl is confirmed. Her father's gift came through last week, the full $47,000. That's what funds the Forsyth Legacy Endowment contribution, by the way, so I need that relationship protected. Another pause. The Marsh family may push back. They're not the first. The review request goes to me anyway. That's how the charter reads. Nothing moves without my signature. I've been doing this for 6 years, Gerald. Not one formal action. The system works because I run it. Let me run it. She put back the music stand. She walked home. She told her father she thought there might be something wrong with how the scholarship money worked, that she had heard a name. She wrote Kellerman on a piece of paper and put it on the kitchen table. Ezra looked at it for a long time. Then he made a call. What he didn't know, sitting at that kitchen table with the piece of paper in front of him, was that he was about to discover a pattern that had been running for 6 years. That 47 men were going to fill a concert hall in 4 days. That the word background and the phone call behind the door and the name on the paper and the $247,800 that had been quietly redirected from the children of families who couldn't afford the January 15th deadline was going to be the end of Preston Alton Forsyth. But first, there was one more thing he needed to do. He needed to call Knox. Knox Farrell, road name Ironside, 61 years old, had spent 6 years as a CPS intake worker before he quit in a state of disgust that had never fully passed. He had a face that looked like a closed fist and the specific patience of a man who had watched systems fail children while the paperwork moved in the opposite direction of the problem. He knew what background was a code word for. He had been hearing it used as a closing door his entire career. He answered on the second ring. Ezra told him everything. The letter, the foyer, the word background, the phone call through the door, the name Kellerman. 6 years of the same assessment process run by the same man with no external review. The scholarship fund routing back through his own desk. The board that heard a complaint 3 years ago and dismissed it in 11 days. 11 days, when the stated timeline was 4 to 6 weeks, right after a $47,000 donor gift arrived. Knox listened without interrupting. When Ezra finished, there were 4 seconds of silence. "Friday night," Knox said. "You're going to that concert." "I'm going." "Then we're all going." That was the entire conversation. No questions about proof, no conversation about legal exposure, no strategy session. Just 2 men who had known each other long enough that one of them saying this is wrong was sufficient for the other. The next morning, Knox sent a single text to the chapter. Ezra's kid was cut from a concert for her background. Friday night, dress decent. By Thursday, 47 men had confirmed. Not one of them asked for more explanation. Not one of them asked what they were going to do when they got there. Knox hadn't told them to do anything except show up and be present, and that was enough, because every man in that chapter knew, from years of riding together, from years of watching Ezra come through when it mattered and leave before anyone could thank him, that this was a man who had never asked for a single thing. He was asking now, obliquely, by saying nothing. That was more than enough. Among those who confirmed were men who would, before the weekend was over, dismantle 6 years of a carefully constructed fraud. A man named Dale Hooper, road name Razorback, 54 years old, 19 years in the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division, who would have the scholarship fraud structure mapped from bank records within 90 minutes of sitting down with a spreadsheet. A man named Clyde Fenton, road name Dust Cloud, 58, former high school principal, retired, who knew every procedural requirement in private school accreditation standards and could identify a charter violation from across a room. A woman named Vera Holt, road name Knotwood, 49, former special education teacher and licensed school counselor, who would be the first person to sit with Waverly after the concert and explain, in language an 11-year-old deserved to hear, exactly what her voice meant and what it had always been. And a young man named Cal Briggs, road name Halftone, 33, managed the chapter's social media presence, who the following morning would post a single photograph with a caption, 6 words long, and watch it get shared 340,000 times in 48 hours. But none of that had happened yet. On Thursday night, the night before the concert, Ezra Marsh sat at the kitchen table across from his daughter. She had the score open in front of her. Not practicing. She didn't need to practice anymore. Just reading through it the way she'd been reading through it for 9 months. The way you return to something that holds something important. Just to confirm it's still there. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. "You scared?" he said. She thought about it the way she always thought. Carefully, taking the question seriously, not answering faster than she was ready to answer. Not of singing," she said. The catch on the N was mild. She didn't stop for it. "What then?" She looked down at the score. Her finger moved to the top right corner. The pencil inscription she had read 100 times without asking about it. She did not touch it, just pointed toward it, barely. "I don't want to do it wrong," she said. "For him." The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, 31 degrees and still. Ezra did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You couldn't." She looked up at him. "He would have loved your voice," Ezra said. "I know it." She looked at him, just looked, and something in her face, the wide gray eyes, the stillness, shifted into a different kind of stillness, the kind that isn't waiting for something bad, but for something real. She didn't ask who. She already knew. She closed the score. She put it in her school bag. She went to bed. Ezra sat at the table for a long time after she went upstairs. Then he went to the front closet and took out his ironing board. He ironed his black button-down shirt slowly, with the particular attention of a man who is doing something with his hands, because his hands need something to do. The crease in the collar came out clean. He hung the shirt on the doorframe for tomorrow. His cut was folded over the back of the kitchen chair. He left it there. Tomorrow, he was going to walk into a building that had decided his daughter's voice was the wrong kind of voice. He was going to sit in the back rows of that building with 46 brothers. And then, if the opening that needed to exist actually presented itself, if the pieces fell the way he thought they might, he was going to do something for the first time in 8 years. He was going to conduct. And then, if Waverly was there, if she had her score, if she was ready, if she still wanted to after everything that Foyer had done to her, he was going to tell 200 people something he had never told anyone in his current life. He put the ironing board away. He turned out the light. What he didn't know, couldn't know yet, was that 47 men sitting in rows in their cuts were going to be the least surprising thing that happened in that concert hall on Friday night. The most surprising thing was what was in the program. Specifically, the name in the composer credit on page 4. 42 minutes from now, someone was going to read that name. And then they were going to look at the back of the man standing at the front of the hall with a baton in his hand. And then they were going to read the name again. And the room was going to change. The motorcycles arrived at 7:06 p.m., not in a formation that roared or announced itself. They came in groups of 4 and 5, pulling into the overflow lot across the road from Harwell Academy's main entrance, engines dropping to idle and then cutting off one by one until the lot was quiet. 47 motorcycles in 2 rows, parked with the neat precision of men who had been riding together long enough that formation was habit. 47 men climbed off. Some were in their 60s. One was 72. They stood in the cold for a moment, the frost coming off the asphalt, breath visible in the December air. And then, without any instruction, they began walking toward the front entrance. In their cuts, helmets in their hands, or tucked under their arms, moving at a measured pace that was not slow and was not urgent, just present. The foyer was still in the middle of its reception when the first of them came through the main door. A woman near the check-in table saw them and stopped talking mid-sentence. The man she was talking to turned. The string quartet did not stop. They were professional and trained to continue regardless. But the first violinist's eye drifted to the entrance and stayed there for one long measure. Now, you might be thinking, 47 Hells Angels walking into a private school fundraiser the night a biker's daughter was excluded. You know what comes next. You've seen this story. The confrontation. The fists. The carefully arranged dinner tables overturned. The school board members backing against the wall. That is not what happened. They walked to the general seating area. They found their rows. They sat down. They placed their helmets on the floor beside them, or held them in their laps. They did not speak to the board members. They did not approach Forsyth. The man named Knox, road name Ironside, the one with the patience of someone who had spent 6 years watching systems fail in slow motion, simply sat in the center of the back row and folded his hands in his lap and waited. That was it. 47 men in motorcycle cuts sitting in the back rows of a private school concert hall, in perfect stillness, and the room around them did not know what to do with that. The board members near the stage whispered to each other. An administrative assistant moved toward the door and then stopped. Forsyth, standing at the side of the stage reviewing the program notes, looked at the back rows for a long moment. His expression did not change. But his hand, the one holding the program, folded the papers once, then twice, then once more, a small mechanical motion that had nothing to do with reading. He did not approach them. There are people whose authority depends on never being the one to flinch. Forsyth was one of those people. He had understood immediately, with the institutional reflexes of a man who had been managing optics for 25 years, that walking toward those rows was the wrong move. Asking them to leave would require a confrontation he could not control. He had looked at the back rows and calculated and decided, correctly, that their presence alone would not stop the concert. What he had not calculated was what would happen 15 minutes later when the green room door opened and the assistant director walked out with her phone in her hand and her face the particular color of someone who has just delivered very bad news. The guest conductor's voicemail played on speakerphone in the green room at 7:21 p.m., 7 minutes before the scheduled start. A flight delay in Cincinnati. A connection missed. He was sorry, deeply, genuinely sorry, but he would not be able to make it. He had tried to reach the Academy's main line for the past hour. He hoped the situation could be managed. The room held 9 people. The assistant director, 3 student musicians who had followed her in, 2 board members who had slipped backstage, Forsyth, Ezra, who had come backstage because Waverly had been told to wait in the wings, and he was not leaving her alone back there. And a woman in her mid-40s named Adrienne Polk, Waverly's homeroom teacher, who had come backstage to find Waverly and was now standing near the door holding a copy of the note she had sent to Forsyth's office 3 weeks ago, recommending Waverly for the solo. She had brought it with her tonight without being entirely sure why. She was sure now. The voicemail ended. The room was quiet for 3 seconds. One of the board members said, "We'll have to cancel the student showcase portion and let the orchestra play." Forsyth said, "That's the right call. The program can—" A parent who had slipped in behind Adrienne said, "You can't cancel. These kids have been preparing since September. My son." The room broke into simultaneous voices, and Ezra, who had been standing near the back wall, walked to the conductor's podium. He did not say anything. He did not explain himself. He picked up the baton from the stand beside the podium. The room did not go quiet, because he said something. The room went quiet because of the way his hand closed around the baton, the specific grip, the placement of the index finger, the stillness of his wrist, the way his shoulders settled a half-inch when the baton was in his hand, as if something that had been slightly displaced for a long time had returned to its correct position. The way you watch a man pick up a tool he has held 10,000 times. He turned to the student orchestra. 17 young musicians with instruments half-raised, uncertain whether to sit or stand, watching him with the specific attention of trained players who recognize authority without needing to be told where it comes from. He raised the baton. He gave them a breath cue, not a word, not a gesture beyond a slight expansion of his chest, and the orchestra came in together, cleanly, for the first time all evening. The assistant director's mouth was open, the board member with the program in her hand, a woman named Marion Colt, 67, retired music teacher, who had sat in the 8th row of a regional festival 14 years ago and watched a young associate conductor make a student ensemble sound like a professional one. turned very still. She looked at the baton. She looked at the back of the man holding it. She looked at the program in her hand. Page 4. The composer credit for December Canticle for Young Voices. E. Caldwell Marsh. She looked at the man at the podium. His lanyard, worn from the Academy's check-in table and clipped to his jacket pocket, had his name printed in block letters. Ezra C. Marsh, General Admission. She looked at the program. She looked at the lanyard. She looked at the program again. She said nothing. She sat down slowly and held the program in both hands, and did not take her eyes off the back of the man at the podium for the next 12 minutes, while he ran a student orchestra through the opening warm-up pieces of the winter showcase with the quiet authority of someone who had been doing this most of his adult life, in a different city, under a slightly different name, before a child died, and the music stopped. The main concert hall filled at 7:30 p.m., 340 seats, 208 occupied. The 47 men in the back rows were visible from every seat in the house. They sat in their rows, with their helmets in their laps, or on the floor beside them. Knox Farrell, road name Ironside, had his hands folded. The man to his left, a former Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agent named Dale Hooper, road name Razorback, who had spent 19 years reconstructing financial fraud trails and had already, on the drive over, begun composing in his head the questions he was going to need answered about the Arts Foundation's filing structure, was very still. The audience saw them, and a murmur moved through the rows. A mother leaned to her husband and whispered something. 2 board members in the 3rd row spoke behind their programs. Nobody got up. Nobody called for them to be removed. The program had already begun, and the assistant director, backstage, had already made the only decision that was available to her, which was to let the evening proceed. Forsyth stood at the side of the stage. His program was folded into a tight square in his right hand. The opening pieces ran: the younger students, 2 short choral numbers, a solo violin, standard showcase material. The audience applauded at the right moments. The 47 men in the back rows applauded too, correctly, with everyone else, in a way that was somehow more pointed for being completely proper. It was during the intermission between the younger students' pieces and the senior chorus that Marion Colt leaned to the woman beside her, a board member she had known for 3 years, and showed her the program. Page 4. The composer credit. The man at the podium. The board member read it again. "That's not possible," she said. "Look at his lanyard," Marion said. The board member looked. She looked for a long time. "He's here for his daughter," Marion said quietly. "The girl who was excluded." The board member was quiet for the rest of the intermission. When the house lights came back down, and Ezra walked back to the podium, she watched him the way people watch someone when they have just understood something that changes the shape of every prior thing. She watched his hands on the baton. She thought about what Forsyth had said in that foyer: background, foundational preparation, community programs, and she thought about the composer credit on page 4. She thought about both of those things in the same moment, and something in her chest went cold. After the first major piece concluded, a choral arrangement, student voices rising cleanly in the well-designed acoustics of a room built by someone who cared about how sound moves, Ezra turned to the audience. He spoke at a concert hall volume, not loud, shaped the way sound is shaped by a man who has spent years knowing exactly how far a voice needs to travel and how little force it needs to carry all the way to the back rows. He said he would like to make one modification to the program. He would like the girl who had been removed from the chorus to sing the solo on December Canticle for Young Voices. Forsyth moved from the side of the stage. His voice, also shaped, also practiced. "The program has been set. Unauthorized changes to a formal presentation aren't—" Ezra looked at him. just looked. It was not a threatening look. It contained no anger that was legible as anger. It was the look of a man who has had 8 years of something building quietly in his chest, and who has just decided to stop holding it back, and whose stillness in this moment is vast enough to fill a concert hall. It was the look you give someone when you know something about yourself, about your history, about what you have survived, about what you have been carrying, that they do not have the context to understand, and their absence of context is itself a kind of silence. Forsyth stopped speaking. The room was very quiet. Ezra turned to the front rows and said, at the same measured volume, slightly softer now, "That piece was written for a boy who never got to hear it. I'd like a girl who knows every note to sing it now, if you don't mind." 23 words. The board member in the third row with the program in her hands looked at the composer, credit. E. Caldwell Marsh. She looked at the man at the podium. She looked at the lanyard. She understood that she was looking at the composer of the piece that had been performed at Harwell Academy's showcase for 3 years, by a program that had just excluded his daughter, using a scholarship fund that he had never been told the rules of. She looked at Marion Colt. Marion Colt looked back. Nobody spoke. At the side of the stage, Waverly appeared. Dark green velvet dress with the uneven hem, black flats, the left toe faintly compressed, the worn score held against her chest with both arms. Unnecessary. She had never needed it, but she had brought it the way you bring something you are afraid of losing or having taken. She stood at the edge of the stage and looked out at the house, and for 1 full second, the width of her gray eyes was visible from the back rows. 47 men in cuts looked at a small girl in a second-hand dress, standing at the edge of a stage that had tried to close itself to her. Nobody objected. Ezra did not conduct her. He stood with the baton at his side. For the first 32 bars, he faced the orchestra, keeping them together, the light cues, the breathing, everything a conductor does that an audience doesn't notice when it's working. The orchestra was steady. These were good students, trained, responsive, and they were playing the way musicians play when they understand that something unusual is happening, and the most useful thing they can do is hold the tempo exactly. Then Ezra turned, slowly, without drama. He turned so that his back was to the audience, and he was facing the rear wall of the concert hall, looking toward the back rows, toward 47 men sitting in silence with their helmets in their laps, toward Knox Farrell with his hands folded, toward the back wall. He stood with the baton at his side. He was still. Waverly was singing to her father's back. She had done this before, every morning for 9 months, through an open kitchen door, singing to a man who stood at the counter or sat at the table, or leaned in the doorway, and never turned around, because turning around would mean she could see his face, and she didn't need to see his face to know. She knew. She had always known. She sang to his back because that was how they had always done it. This private exchange of music and silence, and it was enough. And tonight, it was enough again. She knew every note. She sang every note. Her voice in that room, the acoustic of a hall designed by someone who cared, the silence of 200 people who had stopped thinking about anything else, the December air cold at the windows and warm inside. Her voice was clear and steady, and completely without the stutter that a credentialed professional had certified would disqualify her. It was gone. It was always gone when she sang. In the back rows, Knox Farrell had his head slightly bowed. The man beside him had his hat in both hands. The man 3 seats down, the one who had not said a word since they pulled into the overflow lot, who had a daughter of his own who was 12, and who had not known, pulling on his cut that morning, that he was going to feel this particular thing tonight. Had his eyes forward, and his hands pressed flat on his thighs. Nobody moved. Not one of the 47 men who had driven here tonight to be present, to be witness, to make sure Waverly Marsh knew that she had people in this room, whether or not the program said her name. Not one of them moved. Ezra stood at the front of the hall with his back to the audience, and his daughter sang to him, and the piece he had written in the year his son was born. The piece Eli had slept through in a car seat at 6 months old, the best memory Ezra had, the piece he had not been able to hear for 8 years, because he could not hear it without hearing also everything that came after. The piece moved through the air of a concert hall in a town he had moved to when his life ended and began again, and it was received, finally, by the person it had always been waiting for. When the last note ended, the silence lasted 4 full seconds, the particular silence of an audience that has not yet decided whether to breathe. The first person to stand was a woman in the 11th row. She was 58 years old. She had never heard this piece before. She didn't know the composer's name, or the story of the excluded girl, or the 47 men in the back. She had a father she had lost 3 years ago, and something about the man's back and the child's voice had arrived in the same place in her chest, and she stood up because it was the only thing her body knew how to do. Then the row beside her. Then the row behind. Then the whole hall, like something falling, unstoppable, beginning. Forsyth was no longer standing at the side of the stage. The investigation began in a parking lot. Dale Hooper, Razorback, was leaning against his bike in the overflow lot at 9:17 p.m. when Thomas Greer walked out of the main entrance alone. Greer was 58 years old, 16 years as Arts Foundation Board Treasurer, the man who had known for 2 years that a secondary account existed and had chosen, with the particular discipline of someone who has decided not to know a thing, never to ask what it was for. He had a program rolled in his hand. He had the look of a man who had just made a decision he was going to have to live with one way or another. He walked directly to Razorback. "You're going to want to talk to me," Greer said. Razorback looked at him. "Probably," he said. He made 2 calls. By 10:30 p.m., 9 brothers were gathered at the chapter's workshop location on Route 12, the kind of building that looked like a garage from the road and was a functional meeting space inside, a table big enough for documents, good light, a secondary screen on the wall. Greer sat at one end with a briefcase he had brought from his car. Razorback sat across from him with a laptop. Knox sat at the far end and said nothing and watched everything. Greer talked for 40 minutes. He had known about the secondary account since year 4 of Forsyth's tenure. The account was labeled in internal processing as Foundation Administrative Receipts, miscellaneous. It received the application processing fees, $340 per rejected applicant, 40 to 50 applicants per cycle, running since year 1. It also received, in irregular amounts at irregular intervals, transfers from the scholarship fund that were classified in the Foundation's internal ledger as administrative reallocation. The external filings, the 990 forms that any member of the public could request, showed only the net scholarship disbursements, the amounts after Forsyth had already taken his cut. Nobody looking at the public filings would see what was missing. You had to know what the original scholarship fund balance was, and then compare it to what was actually disbursed. Greer knew the original balances. He had been the treasurer. He had watched the gap between what came in and what went out grow, year by year, and he had told himself the administrative costs were legitimate, and he had not asked. He had brought bank statements. Razorback opened them and began working. Layer 1 was the pattern. Scholarship fund intake per cycle, then disbursement, then the gap. In year 1, $11,400 unexplained. In year 2, $18,700. In year 3, $29,300. The year after the Della Pruitt complaint. The year after the board had dismissed the family's challenge in 11 days. Year 4, $41,300. Year 5, $49,200. Year 6, current, $53,900. The total, across 6 cycles, was $203,800 from the scholarship fund alone. Add the application processing fees, $340 per rejected applicant, the numbers Greer could confirm for the last 4 cycles, and the figure climbed past $240,000. Accelerating, Razorback said. He was looking at the year-over-year increase. Every year after the complaint was dismissed, the diversion amount goes up. He turned the laptop so Knox could see the column. He understood that the board wasn't going to act. Once he understood that, he pushed harder. Knox looked at the numbers. Where does it go? Personal investment account, Greer said. I don't have access to his personal records, but the transfer destination is listed on the internal ledger as a routing number that doesn't match any foundation account. Layer 2. Razorback cross-referenced the scholarship award dates against the donor gift records Greer had brought. The pattern was there without ambiguity. In 5 of the 6 cycles, the scholarship recipient was the child of a donor who had made a gift to the Arts Foundation in the preceding calendar quarter. In 4 of those 5 cycles, the donor gift and the scholarship award fell within 6 weeks of each other. This is the predetermined structure, Razorback said. He was writing now, a single column of dates and amounts and names, the architecture of the scheme visible in the data. He makes the donor decision at the foundation dinners in April and September. The assessment cycle runs September through November. The assessment is documentation for a decision that was already made. Layer 3 came from a manila envelope that Thomas Greer had been carrying in the interior pocket of his jacket. He set it on the table without saying anything. Inside was a printed copy of a state records request filed 3 years ago by the family of Della Ray Pruitt. Attached to it were Della's actual assessment scores, obtained through the request, showing her objective evaluation numbers. In 3 categories, she had ranked in the top 6 of all applicants. Her subjective potential score, assigned solely by Forsyth, had dropped her to 14th, unranked for consideration. Below Della's file, at the bottom of the envelope, was a second document. Older, the paper slightly soft at the edges. A copy of the Foundation's Scholarship Award announcement for the cycle 3 years prior. Recipient, Caroline Ann Kellerman. Parent donor on record for the preceding quarter, Douglas R. Kellerman. Gift amount, $38,400. Same signature, Razorback said. He had the current cycle's data open beside it. He didn't need to say more. The room understood what it was looking at, a pattern that had held for 6 years, the same structure operating identically against 2 children with documented conditions. The scholarship slot going to the child of the donor both times. Nobody spoke. The refrigerator in the corner of the workshop hummed. Outside, on Route 12, a truck downshifted somewhere on the hill. Then Razorback said quietly to Knox, "This isn't evidence of a mistake. This is evidence of a system." He built a machine. The cowards' confrontation happened separately at 11:45 p.m. in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner on Route 7. Gerald Holbrook, 63 years old, Arts Foundation board chair, the man on the other end of the phone call Waverly had heard through the door, Forsyth's Gerald, had not gone home after the concert. He had driven to the diner and ordered coffee he wasn't drinking, and sat in a corner booth staring at the table. Knox had his number from a chapter contact who had known Holbrook through the County Historical Society. He texted it to Razorback. Razorback and a brother named Clyde Fenton, road name Dust Cloud, 58. Former high school principal who knew private school accreditation standards the way other men know weather, walked into the diner at 11:45 p.m. and sat down across from Holbrook without being invited. Holbrook looked at them. He was a thin man, 63, a face that had spent a career in the specific posture of institutional authority. That posture was gone now. He looked like a man who had been sitting in a booth for 2 hours waiting for something to arrive and had just understood what it was. Razorback put the manila envelope on the table. He didn't open it. He just put it there. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning. Or I make one call and you answer to people with considerably less patience than I have right now." Holbrook looked at the envelope. He looked at the two men across from him. He looked at the envelope again. "The complaint 3 years ago," he said. "The Pruitt girl." "Start there," Razorback said. Holbrook talked for 35 minutes. He talked the way people talk when they have been carrying something they told themselves wasn't heavy and have finally put it down and feel. With the first real clarity they've had in 3 years, exactly how heavy it was. The Pruitt family had filed correctly, through the proper channels. The complaint had landed on the board's desk. Holbrook had assigned the review to himself, which was permitted under the charter, the same charter that routed every review back to Forsyth's desk for final disposition. He had received Forsyth's documentation. He had reviewed it. He had seen the objective scores. He had seen them, had seen Della in the top 6, had seen the subjective score pulling her down to 14th, and he had told himself that subjective assessment was within Forsyth's professional authority to determine. The Kellerman gift had arrived 9 days before he dismissed the complaint. He had not connected those two things deliberately. That was the thing he kept returning to, in the booth, at 11:45 p.m., talking to two men in motorcycle cuts who were watching him with the patience of people who have heard every version of this particular explanation and are waiting for the actual truth underneath it. He had not made the connection deliberately. He had simply not made himself look at both facts at the same time. "You saw the file," Dust Cloud said. "You saw she was in the top 6. "Yes." "And you dismissed it in 11 days. "Yes." "When the stated timeline was 4 to 6 weeks. A pause. "Yes." The room was quiet for a moment. "She was 13, Dust Cloud said, not as an accusation, as a fact that he was placing in the space between them and leaving there. Holbrook looked at the table. His coffee had gone cold. He had not touched it since they sat down. This was the part, Razorback thought afterward, that never stopped being true. The villain was easy to understand. Forsyth had made a calculation, risk versus return, sustained over 6 years, with the careful management of anyone who has decided that what they are doing is something the institution will accommodate as long as the documentation is clean. That kind of deliberateness was terrible, but it was legible. Holbrook was different. Holbrook had seen a 13-year-old girl's scores, had seen the gap between what the numbers said and what the decision said, and had chosen, not with malice, but with the practiced art of institutional comfort, not to look at both things at the same time. He had built the wall inside himself 1 brick at a time, and called it professional discretion. "What I need from you now," Razorback said, "is everything. Every communication, every document you have, every meeting, every dollar amount you have access to. And I need it tonight." Holbrook nodded. He picked up his phone. He started making calls. The FBI contacted Knox at 9:23 a.m. Saturday. Special Agent Diana Marsh, No relation, a fact she stated immediately and without any observable reaction, arrived at the workshop on Route 12 at 10:45 a.m. She was 46, plain clothes, the face of someone who has been working a case for longer than she would like, and whose exhaustion has settled into a particular quality of attention. Very still, very thorough, the kind of alertness that coffee has stopped touching. She stated her name and office. Knox acknowledged with a nod. He did not extend a hand. She said, "I'm told you have something relevant to an open federal investigation." Knox said, "Depends on what you're investigating." She said, "Preston Alton Forsyth, and a man named Gerald Holbrook." Knox looked at Razorback. A decision was made without words. Then Knox said, "How long has your office known about Forsyth?" The agent was quiet for a moment. 8 months, she said. "We've been building a case on the financial structure, the scholarship fund routing, the shell account." 8 months, Knox said. "We needed the internal ledger documentation. We didn't have access to the Foundation's secondary account records through official channels. We had the public 990 filings. We had the routing number. We didn't have the source documents. Waverly Marsh has been excluded from a program she prepared for 9 months, Knox said. You had 8 months. The agent had no answer for this. She didn't pretend to have one. She simply sat with it, the way honest people sit with true things that are uncomfortable. Razorback laid the documents out on the table one at a time. The Foundation's internal ledger, the 6-year transaction record, Greer's bank statements, the Pruitt file, the Kellerman gift correlation, Holbrook's communications, which Holbrook had provided at 1:30 a.m., and which Razorback had organized by date and dollar amount through the night. He placed a phone face up on the table. He played a 47-second recording, a reconstruction of the relevant portion of Forsyth's side of the phone call, as dictated by Waverly to her father that Tuesday night, transcribed and corroborated by Holbrook's own account of the same call. Agent Marsh stopped writing. She set her pen down. She leaned forward slightly. "The internal ledger fills the gap we haven't been able to close," she said. Her voice was careful, measured, the voice of someone who does not make statements she will have to retract. "We had the routing number and the public filings. We didn't have the source transaction records. This establishes the diversion at the point of origin." She paused. "If the secondary account statements match the routing number we have on file, this changes the scope of the charges significantly." Knox stated one condition for full cooperation. Waverly Marsh gets a victim advocate assigned before any interview. Nobody talks to her without her asking first. The agent looked at him for a moment. "That's already required under the Victim Services Protocol for cases involving minors. But yes, before the first interview. Then you have everything we have." She stood, gathered the documents. She would need authenticated copies, official evidence chain, all of it to go through proper channels. But the foundation was there. The architecture was documented. After 8 months of building from the outside, the inside had just been handed to her. "Agent Marsh," Knox said, as she reached the door. She turned. "You do right by her." "A beat. That's the job," she said. The door closed. Razorback sat back in his chair. Outside, Route 12 was running with Saturday morning traffic. The morning light came through the workshop's high windows in long, flat lines across the table. The system, Razorback had said the night before, was not broken. That was the thing people misunderstood. A broken system could be fixed. This one had worked exactly as designed, with the careful slowness of institutions built to require proof, to move deliberately, to protect rights. Nobody designed it to be cruel. It turned out that way sometimes, when the person inside it needed saving faster than the paperwork could catch up. The brothers hadn't replaced the system. They had handed it what it needed to work. The scope, when Razorback laid it out Saturday afternoon, with all documents assembled, was this: 11 additional children, identified from the assessment files Holbrook had turned over, whose objective scores had placed them in the top tier of applicants across 6 cycles, and whose subjective scores had dropped them out of contention. 11 families who had paid $340 in non-refundable application fees. 11 scholarship slots that had gone elsewhere. $247,800 in diverted funds across 6 years. A previous victim, Della Ray Pruitt, 13, now 16, whose family had done everything correctly, filed correctly, been failed correctly, in 11 days. And a named endowment, $47,000, Forsyth's own money, deposited into his own legacy fund 8 months ago, drawn from the investment account fed by 6 years of diversions. The board had celebrated it at a dinner, the Forsyth Arts Legacy Fund. His name, in perpetuity, attached to an institution he had been quietly looting for 6 years. The charges, when the FBI filed late Saturday afternoon, were scholarship fund diversion, felony, 6 counts corresponding to 6 annual cycles, wire fraud, RICO predicate acts for the Coordinated Donor Allocation Scheme, and pending audit of the shell account, tax fraud on unreported income averaging $41,300 annually. Gerald Holbrook was charged separately, obstruction of justice, and breach of fiduciary duty for the Pruitt complaint dismissal. The Forsyth Arts Legacy Fund was quietly withdrawn from the Foundation's records by the board at an emergency Sunday morning session, 71 hours after Halftone posted the photograph of 47 men in motorcycle cuts sitting in concert hall rows with the caption, "She sang." We listened. 340,000 shares, still climbing. When federal agents arrived at Preston Forsyth's residence at 11:13 a.m. Sunday, he was in his kitchen. He was making coffee. He had his reading glasses on and his phone in his hand. He looked up when the door opened the way a man looks up when he is interrupted during a normal morning. He asked once, quietly, if someone could call his neighbor about his mail. As if that were the thing that needed handling. As if the $200,000 and the 11 children and the woman named Della Pruitt, who had been 13 and had filed correctly and been dismissed in 11 days, could wait while he sorted out his correspondence. He was led out with his hands behind his back, in his reading glasses, in the morning light, and he did not look like a monster. He looked like a man in reading glasses who had been interrupted during a normal morning. That was, as it always is, the most disturbing part. After the applause, Ezra walked to where Waverly was standing at the edge of the stage. He moved, without hurry, through the silence that was still settling, past the orchestra students who were half standing, past the board member in the 3rd row who still had the program in her hands, and had not yet moved. He climbed the 2 steps to the stage level and crossed to where his daughter stood in her green velvet dress, with the worn score held against her chest, and he knelt down. Not to her eye level. She was 11 and tall enough, and his knees gave slightly on the step the way knees give after a long time of carrying something. But he knelt because there was no other way to hold her face in both hands, carefully, the way you handle something you almost lost, and didn't. He was quiet for a moment. The hall was quiet too, the particular quiet of people who understand they are watching something they have no business interrupting. Then he said, "He would have loved your voice, Wave. I know it." She did not ask who. She already knew. She had known since the Saturday morning she found the score in the storage box, since the pencil inscription at the top of the first page. since 9 months of open kitchen doors, and a father who always found a reason to be nearby. She had known, and she had held it carefully, and tonight she had done the only thing she had known how to do with that knowledge, which was to sing. She leaned her forehead against his. He put his arms around her. The worn score was between them, pressed against his shirt, the paper and pencil smell of it present in the way familiar things are present, simply, permanently, having always been there. In the back rows, Knox Farrell looked at his hands. Nobody said anything for a long time. The immediate aftermath was not dramatic. Dramatic things had already happened. What remained was the work of it, the steady, practical, unglamorous labor of making a wrong thing right in the ways that can actually be made right, which are never all the ways. Vera Holt, road name Knotwood, 49, former special education teacher, licensed school counselor, found Waverly 20 minutes after the performance, in the green room, sitting on a folding chair with the score in her lap and a cup of hot cider someone had pressed into her hands. Ezra was nearby, talking in low voices with Knox. Vera pulled a chair beside Waverly and sat down. She did not start with questions. She started by sitting. "Can I tell you something about your voice?" she said after a moment. Waverly looked at her. She pressed her thumbnail to her finger briefly and then stopped. Yes, she said. Vera told her. She told her about the neuroscience, not in clinical language, in the language you use when you are explaining something important to a person who deserves to understand it completely. She told her that the parts of the brain that manage speech fluency and the parts that manage singing fluency are neurologically distinct. They run on different pathways. They use different rhythm systems, different hemispheric activation, different motor coordination. A stutter in speech tells you nothing about a person's capacity for vocal performance. They are separate systems. The stutter is in one room. The singing is in a different room entirely, down a different hallway, lit differently, accessed differently. Forsyth's documentation had acknowledged the stutter. It had not acknowledged this distinction. The distinction is in every introductory speech pathology reference published in the last 30 years. It was not obscure. It was not contested. It was simply information that Forsyth had chosen not to include, because including it would have complicated the decision he had already made. "He knew," Waverly said. It was not a question. Vera looked at her steadily. "The documentation was submitted with your application. He had the clinical file." Waverly was quiet for a moment. She looked at the score in her lap, the small purple star a child had made in the margin when she reached a part she loved. "Okay," she said. Not resignation. Something else. The particular steadiness of a person who has just had a thing they already suspected confirmed, and finds it easier to hold than the suspicion was. Named things are manageable in a way that suspected things are not. "You have an extraordinary voice," Vera said. "That is not a compliment. It is a clinical observation from someone who has worked with hundreds of young singers." Waverly looked at her. The wide gray eyes held contact. "Thank you," she said. No stutter on the T. The school arranged itself around its own crisis, quietly and without grace, the way institutions rearrange when the architecture they were built on has been publicly removed. The Harwell Academy Board held an emergency session on Monday morning. The arts program was placed under interim external administration. The accreditation review that Dust Cloud, Clyde Fenton, 58, former principal, had flagged began through the state's private school oversight office on Tuesday. He had identified 4 separate violations of the accreditation standards in Forsyth's assessment process. No published rubric for the subjective evaluation component. No external review mechanism. No documentation of how appeals were processed. and no conflict of interest disclosure for an evaluator who also chaired the scholarship committee that heard complaints about his own decisions. Each violation was individually sufficient for a formal review. Together, they were sufficient for immediate suspension of the assessment process pending audit. The anonymous administrative assistant, the woman who had processed 4 years of application fees and been told to route them to the secondary account, and who had kept a personal log of the transaction since year 3 without entirely knowing why, brought her log to Knox's contact the morning after the concert. She was trembling when she handed it over. Knox's contact, a woman named Patty from the chapter's community liaison network, sat with her for 2 hours at the kitchen table and made sure she understood exactly what a cooperating witness was and what it was not, and that the protection available to her was real and not conditional, and did not depend on how useful her information turned out to be. The log covered 41 months. It had dates, amounts, and the routing destination written in a careful hand in a spiral notebook that the assistant had kept in the bottom drawer of her desk at home. She had not known what she was protecting it against. She had kept it because the instruction to route the fees away from the main account had felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate, and keeping records of wrong things had felt like the only thing she was able to do. Adrienne Polk, homeroom teacher, 43, the woman who had sent the written recommendation to Forsyth's office 2 weeks before the exclusion letter, submitted her copy of the note, dated and time-stamped, to the state's oversight investigation on Wednesday. The date established that the recommendation had been received before the exclusion letter was drafted. The note had been removed from Waverly's file. Its absence from the file, combined with its existence in Adrienne's possession, was the document that moved the discrimination claim from circumstantial to documented. Adrienne had kept the copy because she had a habit, built over 15 years of teaching in institutions where paperwork sometimes disappeared, of keeping copies of things she had sent to administrators. She had not expected to need this one. She had kept it anyway. The scholarship money was a complicated problem. Forsyth had diverted funds over 6 years, and the legal recovery would take time. What was not complicated was what the chapter decided to do immediately. On Thursday, Knox sent a second message to the chapter and to 3 affiliated chapters in Tennessee and Kentucky. By Saturday, $17,400 had been raised. It was not the $247,800. It was not justice in a financial sense, but it was immediate, and it was real, and Ezra did not argue with it. He put it in an account in Waverly's name. He told her it was for whatever she decided to do with her voice when she was old enough to decide. She thought about it for a moment. Could it be for college? She said. It can be for anything, he said. Then college, she said. And then, after a pause, and maybe music. He looked at her. She was at the kitchen table with the score open in front of her, the purple star in the margin, the pencil inscription, the 9 months of mornings layered into the paper like sediment, invisible and permanent. Yeah, he said. Music. The practical matters settled in the weeks that followed with the specific texture of things that require sustained effort and have no dramatic moment of completion. A victim advocate named Cheryl, assigned the morning after the federal charges were filed, before the first official interview, sat with Waverly twice before any formal interview took place. Waverly's interview, when it happened, was attended by Ezra and by Cheryl and by a child forensic specialist from Nashville who had driven down specifically because the case involved a minor. Waverly answered every question. She did not stutter once during the formal interview, which the specialist noted in her report without comment, though she thought about it for the rest of the day. Waverly's enrollment at Callaway Middle School, the public school 4 miles from 414 Sycamore Bend Drive, was processed in January. Her homeroom teacher, who had been informed of the basic outlines of the situation by the district's student welfare coordinator, did not treat her differently. On the 3rd day of school, Waverly raised her hand in class. The teacher called on her. She answered. The class moved on. She joined the school chorus the following week. The chorus director, a woman named Bev, mid-40s, who had spent 20 years in public school music programs and had a particular gift for knowing which students needed to be left alone to grow and which needed to be watched carefully and which needed to be told simply and directly that they were good, heard Waverly sing during the first full rehearsal and stopped the room. "Everybody listen," Bev said. "That is what this piece is supposed to sound like." Waverly looked at the floor. Then she looked up. Her shoulders, for a fraction of a second, did something that Ezra, watching from the hallway window, because he had driven her and had not yet left, recognized. They dropped about an inch, the only moment she fully released. He stood in the hallway for a while after that. Then he walked to his bike and sat on it in the parking lot for a few minutes without starting it, looking at the school building through the January light. The heat of the engine, the cold of the air, both at once, the way things often are. He started the bike. He drove home. He had left the kitchen door open that morning before she woke up. Habit now. He probably always would. 3 weeks after the concert, on a Saturday in January, Ezra drove to the chapter's meeting space to pick up some paperwork Knox had for him. He arrived early. He sat in the parking lot for a moment because there was no reason to hurry. Through the front window he could see Vera Holt at the folding table inside, talking to a woman he didn't recognize, a mother, he gathered from the age and the posture, the particular posture of someone who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just been told they can put it down. Vera had her hands folded on the table and was speaking slowly and clearly in the way she always spoke to people who needed information, presented without noise around it. He had watched Vera do this before. He had watched Knox do it. He had watched Razorback reconstruct a fraud trail in 90 minutes and Dust Cloud identify 4 accreditation violations, while most people in the room were still processing what had happened on stage. He had watched 47 men sit in a concert hall and do nothing except be present, and he had understood, in the particular way you understand things when you have been the person who needed that particular kind of presence, how much that nothing was. He was not proud of himself. That was the thing he had not expected. He had expected relief, which was there. He had expected the specific grief that lives alongside relief, the understanding that what had been taken from Waverly in those 3 weeks between the exclusion letter and the concert, the internal architecture of her confidence, the way she had stopped raising her hand in class, the callus forming on her finger. None of that could be fully returned, only worked around, slowly, with time and stability, and a chorus director named Bev, who stopped the room and told everyone to listen. He had expected grief and relief in the same place, which was where they always lived. He had not expected to feel, for the first time in 8 years, that December Canticle was fully finished. Not the composition. It had always been complete. But the piece had been written for something, for someone, and it had been waiting in a box in a labeled storage container for 6 years for someone to find it. And someone had. And she had sung it in a room full of people who needed to hear it. To a man who needed to hear it. And it was done now in the way only the things we make for love are ever done, by being given away. He sat in the parking lot for a long time. Then he went inside and got the paperwork. On the drive home, he stopped at a red light. A woman in the car beside him was singing along to something, loud enough that he could hear the faint shape of it through both sets of closed windows. He couldn't tell what it was. It didn't matter. He looked at her for a moment, happy, unself-conscious, just singing. And he felt the thing he had been feeling for 3 weeks, but hadn't had words for yet. Gratitude. Not for the outcome. For the 9 months of mornings. For the open kitchen door. For a child who found a score in a box and taught herself every note, and left the door open and trusted him to be there, without asking him to say so. The light changed. He drove home. He put the kettle on. He left the kitchen door open. He stood at the counter and waited for her to come downstairs. 8 months later, in September, Waverly Marsh stood at the front of a conference room at the Tennessee State Department of Education and spoke for 7 minutes about the experience of being assessed for a school arts program at the age of 11. She had been invited by the state's Arts Education Policy Working Group, which had convened in the wake of the Forsyth case to review the guidelines around subjective assessment criteria in publicly funded scholarship programs. The working group was examining whether the absence of external review mechanisms, the single evaluator structure, the unpublished rubric, the appeals process that routed back to the same desk, was unique to Harwell or represented a broader structural problem. Waverly's testimony was 7 minutes long. She had written it herself. She had practiced it at the kitchen table with Ezra sitting across from her, not coaching, just present. The stutter was there, mild and managed, and she had stopped routing around it 2 months ago. She said her name correctly and moved on. The room listened. She explained what it felt like to spend 9 months preparing for something and receive a letter telling you that you were not the right kind of person for it. She explained what the word background communicated and what it did not say out loud. She explained that her stutter disappeared when she sang, that this was a documented neurological fact, and that the person who assessed her had the clinical file and had not included this fact in his decision. She said this without accusation, flatly, as information. She said the system had a gap in it. She said the gap allowed one person to make a decision with no one checking whether the decision matched the data. She said she thought that was fixable. The working group chair asked her a question. She answered it. She did not look at the floor. The policy amendment passed in November. All subjective arts assessment criteria in state-administered or state-adjacent scholarship programs required a published rubric, minimum 2 evaluators, and an external review mechanism that did not route back to the assigning evaluator. It was named the Marsh Amendment in the working group's internal documentation. The official filing used the full formal title, but the people in that room knew what it was, and most of them used the shorter version. 3 months after the testimony, a brother named Cal Briggs, road name Halftone, 33, stopped by 414 Sycamore Bend Drive to drop off something Waverly had left at the chapter meeting space. He knocked. She answered the door. He handed over a water bottle with a chapter logo on it that she had left on a chair. "You doing okay?" he said. Yeah, she said. "Good." He nodded. He turned to go. "Halftone," she said. He turned back. "The post," she said. "The photo. 340,000. He looked at her, a slight smile. 372 by the time it stopped, he said. We had to turn off notifications. She thought about this. "Thank you," she said. "She sang," he said. "We listened." He shrugged. "That's all it said." He walked back to his bike. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went inside and finished her homework. 3 years later, Waverly Marsh was 14 and a freshman at Callaway High School and a member of the school's competitive choir, which had placed second in the regional circuit the previous spring. She was also, 2 afternoons a week, a junior volunteer at the county's Arts Enrichment Program for low-income students, a program that had been created 6 months after the Forsyth case, funded partly by the recovered scholarship funds and partly by a community fundraising campaign, specifically to provide arts access to children who could not afford private school assessment fees. The program's founding principle, written into the charter by the board that created it, including Adrienne Polk, who had joined as an education advisor, was that all assessments were conducted with published criteria, external review, and no financial component for families. On a Tuesday in October, Waverly was helping a group of 9- and 10-year-olds learn the basics of sight reading. There was a girl at the end of the table, 9 years old, small, who had been very quiet for 40 minutes. Not disengaged. The specific quiet of a child who is paying close attention to what the room expects of her before deciding whether to participate. Waverly watched her for a moment. She recognized the look. She had worn it for years, not just in rooms like this, but in every room that required her to calculate the distance between what she was and what was wanted. The combination of attention and restraint. The posture of a person who has learned that being careful is safer than being seen. She picked up a short piece of music, a simple 3-line melody, nothing difficult, and set it in front of the girl. "Can you read this?" she said. The girl looked at the page, looked at Waverly. "I don't—" The catch. She stopped. Waverly waited, not filling the silence, just waiting. "I don't know," the girl finished. Her chin was slightly down. "That's fine," Waverly said. "Listen first." She hummed the line. 3 bars. Slow. "Now you." The girl looked at the music. She opened her mouth. And what came out, clear and true and completely without hesitation, was a voice that stopped the table. Waverly felt something move through her chest. A specific recognition that had no name except the name of the thing it was. She had been here before, in the way that mattered. Not in this room. In a kitchen, at a table, with a piece of music she had found in a box. With the specific stillness of someone who knows something is there, and is waiting to be given permission to let it out. She had learned from a man who stood with his back turned, who let her find it herself, who said that's good, wave and picked up his coffee cup and let that be enough. She pulled her chair closer. "Again," she said, "from the beginning. I'll stay right here." The girl looked at her. Something in her face shifted, the particular shift of a child who has found, against expectation, that a room is safe. That the person across from her is not performing patience, but has it, genuinely, and intends to stay. She looked at the music. She sang. On a Sunday morning in the February after the concert, 3 months out, the frost still hard on the ground, Ezra Marsh sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the worn score of December Canticle for Young Voices open in front of him. Not the copy from Waverly's school bag. His copy, the original, the composer's copy, the one he had kept in the box labeled with his birth name, that Waverly had found on a Saturday and taken to her room and never mentioned and learned entirely in 9 months. He had taken it out this morning while she was still asleep. He was looking at the first page. In the top right corner, his own pencil hand. For Eli. December 2013. Below it, in purple ink, a small star in the margin near bar 8, the part she loved. He looked at them together for a long time. The pencil and the purple. 11 years apart on the same page. A father writing something down for a son who would never read it, and a girl adding her mark without knowing she was finishing a sentence that had been waiting 11 years for its last word. His phone had a folder in it, unlabeled, just a date as the title, the date of the concert. Inside it were photographs. Not the official newspaper photograph, though that was there too. 47 men in cuts in concert hall rows, helmets in laps, front page of the Callaway Register. The other photographs were ones brothers had sent him in the days after. Knocks at the table in the workshop at midnight, documents spread in front of him, Razorback's handwritten column of dates and amounts. Vera and Waverly in the green room, 2 chairs pulled close, Waverly's face in the particular stillness of someone receiving information they have needed for a long time. The photograph of the stage, taken from the back rows, Ezra at the podium with his back to the audience, Waverly at the edge of the stage in green velvet, the house full and silent. He looked at that last photograph for a long moment. He had been asked, since the story had moved through the news cycle and the 340,000 shares and the state policy amendment, what he had been thinking in that moment. When he turned around, when he put his back to 200 people and faced the rear wall, the true answer was nothing he could put in words. He had turned because it was what he had always done. Every morning for 9 months, he had stood with his back to the kitchen and listened, because turning around would mean she could see his face, and she didn't need to see his face to know he was there. The morning she first sang, he had made a choice without quite choosing, to be present without imposing that presence, to receive what she was offering without making her perform it for him, to let the kitchen door and the open air between them be the form that love took that particular morning. He had turned in the concert hall because he understood by then that this was the piece she had been practicing for. Not for the audience, for him. And the only worthy thing he could do with that, the only way to honor 9 months of open kitchen doors, was to stand the way he had always stood and let it come. He thought now about the boy in the car seat who had slept through the premiere, the best memory he had. Eli with his face slack in sleep, completely unconscious of the thing his father had made, and the thing his father had made rising through that old festival hall while 600 people listened. He thought, "You heard it, buddy. 3 years ago last Tuesday, through a kitchen door. You heard all of it." He was not certain this was true. He was certain it was something he needed to be true, and that in the absence of certainty, choosing the truer version was its own kind of faithfulness. He closed the score. He put it back in the center of the table, where Waverly always set it when she came downstairs in the morning. He heard her moving upstairs. The sound of feet on the floor, the particular rhythm of an almost 12-year-old who has not yet learned to be quiet about existing. He picked up his coffee cup. He stood at the counter. He did not turn around. A minute later, the stairs, the kitchen door, already open. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he said. She sat at the table. She pulled the score toward her. She opened it to bar 8, where the star was, and she began to read. He stood at the counter with his coffee and listened. This story is about the word background, not the way it is defined, the way it is used, as a door closing, as a sentence that communicates everything while proving nothing, as the word chosen by people who have learned, carefully, deliberately, over years of practice, to exclude in language that cannot be formally challenged. If you have spent any part of your life standing on the outside of a room while someone used a word like that to explain why the room wasn't for you, you know the specific weight of it. You know it doesn't need to be loud to land hard. You know it is designed to make you doubt yourself rather than question the person who said it. Waverly Marsh was 11 years old, and she felt that word land, and she pressed her thumbnail into her finger, and she did not let it stop her. There are Waverleys everywhere. Children who have been assessed by people with locked filing cabinets and predetermined conclusions. Children whose documented conditions have been used as the justification for a decision that was made before the file was opened. Children who have something real and clear and true inside them that an institution decided, for reasons that had nothing to do with the child, not to see. And there are Ezras, not the biker part, the other part, the part that irons a shirt for his daughter and leaves his cut on the kitchen chair because he doesn't want to make it harder for her. The part that stands at the counter with his back turned and says, "That's good." Wave and picks up his coffee cup and lets that be enough. The part that writes something beautiful for the people he loves and keeps it in a box when the grief is too heavy, and waits, not on purpose, not with a plan, just waits, until the right person finds it. If you are carrying something like that right now, something beautiful that grief or fear or the weight of loss has locked in a box labeled with someone else's name, I want to ask you a question. What would it feel like to leave the kitchen door open? Not to perform it, not to explain it. Just to leave the door open and let the people who love you hear what's in there, at their own pace, in their own time, the way 9-year-olds find things in storage boxes on Saturday afternoons and teach themselves every note. You don't need 47 motorcycles to protect someone. You need to pay attention. You need to notice when a child stops raising their hand in class. You need to ask the uncomfortable question when the assessment result doesn't match what you have seen with your own eyes. You need to be the teacher who keeps the copy, the treasurer who finally can't not say something, the woman in the 11th row who stands up first because something in her chest recognizes something in the room, and her body knows what to do before her mind does. That is what this story is actually about. Not bikers, not a concert hall. A girl who found a score in a box and taught herself every note and sang it through an open kitchen door for 9 months until the morning it was finally ready to be heard somewhere else. And a man who turned around. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and tell me in the comments. Who is the person in your life who left a door open for you? Or who needs you to leave one open for them right now? Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. There are more stories like this one. Stories about the people nobody expected to be the gentle ones. Stories about what happens when the system stops working and someone decides, quietly, that enough is enough. This is the story as it stands today. Waverly Marsh is 14 years old. She sings competitively. She volunteers 2 afternoons a week with children who need someone to pull a chair close and say, again, from the beginning, I'll stay right here. The amendment that changed how arts programs assess students in Tennessee bears her name in the working group notes. And somewhere, in a kitchen on a Tuesday morning, a man stands at the counter with a cup of coffee while his daughter comes downstairs and opens a piece of music to the part she loves and begins to read. He doesn't turn around. He already knows she's there.